Hey everyone, I'm just going to give people a couple seconds to all join in. We'll get started. And thank you guys so much for joining. Today we're going to talk about the MCAT, mastering the MCAT strategies for success. This is part of Med School Week, thanks to Leland, and so we're really excited that Leland gives the opportunity for coaches to share a little bit about what we offer different students. And I'll start by talking a little bit about me. I did my undergrad at Cornell. And was really inspired to become a physician scientist based on my own battle with autoimmune illness. And from there, went to Caltech, did a year there where I had a startup, a biotech startup, and also started tutoring. I really enjoyed the opportunity to bring a different approach to the MCAT to a lot of students, and we'll get to that in just a second. Started with Wyzent. I had my own company for several years. And then I went to Yale. I've been an MD PhD student here for 4 years now. And I'm also part of the admissions committee. So I've gotten to learn a lot about not only the MCAT, but what it takes to really be a compelling applicant, what it takes to really form a compelling narrative to apply. And finally, recently, I joined Leland as part of their coaching team. And we don't have a lot of time today. I want to make them, I think we have about 20-ish minutes, but I want to give a quick breakdown. But all of these things you guys know, right? The MCAT has 4 sections. There's bio, biochem, cars, chem phys, and psych soc. They're all about an hour and a half long. But and they're also broken down into several foundational concepts, right? This is an outline that is fundamental to how this test is created. From Foundation 1, which talks about biomolecules and biochemistry, to higher order biological systems, you get to cells and then organ systems, and then physics and chem, and finally all those different terms you guys need to learn, right, for psych and soc. But what I want to talk about today is a little bit about a misnomer for how this test is actually approached. I think there are amazing resources out there for content. UWorld, you guys will say, hey, UWorld is actually a question bank, but in reality, a lot of what UWorld is to me is a content tool. There's so many questions you learn, but they're not great reasoning questions, not reasoning in the way that the AMC tackles reasoning. And you have Anki, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. It's a flashcard-based tool that really helps with memorization, something that really started with step 1 and step 2 in a lot of medical schools that I know has been shared now with lots of undergrad and postgraduate students. And then you have your test prep companies, Princeton Review, Kaplan, Jack Weston, and as well as Khan Academy. They offer so many different aspects of resources on how to learn the content. But so many people think this is a content test, and I'm here to tell you that it's not. You know, having worked with well over 200 students now that average above a 516 all across the 200 plus, and this year alone, think about the 60 students I worked with average a 521, and most of that came not from them learning the content. It's not about learning, learning the content is like learning a language. What this test is really about, to score high, to score in the 515, 520, those crazy high scores, it's about how you use that language, right? It's really about problem solving and logic. And I want to leave time for questions, so we won't have time to go through lots of different strategies. But the way I learned to do this was to create checklists first. For every section, my goal was, how can we approach this test by being really systematic, right? How do we minimize silly mistakes, minimize errors? You're going to see so many different passages with so many different topics, and it's really humbling, but also scary to know how to approach every single type of question. And so we simplify it the same way the AMC test creators made this test, right? For example, I've showed one of my checklists here, and that is with biochem. There's really 3 fundamental types of questions in biochem. You have a discrete question. Now, this is a question where you're supposed to use your background knowledge in your content to be able to answer it. For example, what kind of cytokines do Th1 CD4 T cells make? And the answer would be interferon gamma, right? It's something that we just know because we've learned it. And that's where all those content tools help. But the reality is the bulk of this test will also come down to being able to score well in these questions, right? The passage-based and the experimental questions. And this is where I really talk about strategy as just a way to systematically approach tough questions the same way, right? There's a lot of logic to how AMC creates this test. It doesn't feel like that, but there really is. And a lot of what I work on with students is building their confidence and their skill set to apply whatever content you learn on questions through these strategies. So passage-based questions, the way I like to approach them is always to read the answer choice first, right? I call that screening, and then scanning, find that information that's in the passage and reread the question. Because by the time you've done these two steps, it might have been 2 minutes. You might forget what the question exactly is asking and then answer it. And it seems simple enough, but as many students learn while we practice this, it takes a lot of time, right? And the third type, which I think is actually the most important skill set to learn in biochem, is how to do well in experimental questions. How do you break down really tough passages with lots of different things going on? In one way, all of my students that score really highly have gotten really good at doing this is by using flowcharts, right? And so a simple way to think about any experiment is that you start with a control, right? We start at a baseline and we adapt. We have a variable, we have some impact that changes, right? So we maybe add a drug, maybe there's a hormone that's acting in a tissue it wasn't acting on before. There's some variable, and finally you're supposed to be able to assess what the output is. Like, what do you take away from the impact of that variable? And to actually help explain this, my last couple slides will really talk about an example, and I want us to break it down together to really see what it means to tackle an experimental passage, right? So this is something I've created, but it's based on, several passages that I've seen in the MCAT, and the point is to highlight how dense the MCAT feels, right? For example, we can read this one. So researchers have established that forkhead box P3, so FOXP3, is a critical transcription factor for the development of regulatory T cells. They're Tregs. And regulatory T cells maintain cytokine homeostasis in various immune environments through negative feedback over a subset of helper T cells known as Th1 CD4 positive T cells. Already, there's a lot going on, right? Upon induction of an effector response, CD4 T cells then produce high amounts of cytokine, like interferon gamma. And this is just a very shortened version of what you're going to see. Some of your MCAT passages will have 6 paragraphs, right, of all of this information. And so many people read this and get overwhelmed, right? And so you get a question. The question is going to ask you, in a global FOXP3 knockout mouse, what would be the expected serum levels of interferon gamma? And they read this and I ask them, okay, what question type was it? Let's remind ourselves, right? Is this a discrete question? Is this something that we can answer right away with our background knowledge? Is it passage-based? Or maybe is it experimental? And a lot of students will tell me, hey, maybe this is discrete, and I don't know the content. And another tip I'm here to tell you is that in the vast majority of tough passages in the MCAT, most of the content is given to you. So when you see that miles down 96-page encyclopedia of all the different things you need to know, you'll be overwhelmed because you're like, oh, there's so much I have to memorize. But then when you get to doing AMC material and AMC passages, you recognize, hey, they tell me a lot of this material. And so what you really need to understand in content is not every single Anki card or every single detail. It helps, right, as you get to the higher scores, but what's really important is your ability to reason and your ability to have a foundational understanding of how the immune system works. Because if I feel confident with the fact that I know what a Treg is, I know what a CD4 helper T cell is, I know how they act together broadly in the immune system, then when I get all this information provided to me, I can put it together, right? I can summarize it and I can really apply strategies. This checklist is a very simple way to approach all biochem questions. So I will tell you, because there's multiple variables involved, there's a knockout mouse in which Tregs are gone and we're trying to figure out what happens to interferon gamma. It's an experimental question, right? You need a flowchart to be able to connect the different variables here. The transcription factor, the Tregs, the cells that Tregs regulate. And so something you'll learn how to do is maybe start with just drawing a flowchart like this. Really? So my first 3 minutes maybe in reading the passage, all I took away was something as simple as this, right? FOXP3 is important for Tregs. I see that here. And Tregs inhibit, right? This is the inhibition arrow. These inhibits CD4 positive Th1 cells. Here we go. And these are known to produce gamma, interferon gamma. And it's all given to me in the passage. And so what this question really then becomes is, because I recognize the question type, I made my flowchart because it's an experimental question. Then it's just arrows, right? If FOXP3 is down, which is what's going to happen in a knockout mouse, right? You knock out a gene, therefore you knock out the ability for that gene to be translated into a protein. So there's going to be no functional FOXP3 protein. Okay. And it tells you in the passage is a critical transcription factor. Remember, transcription factors are those factors that bind, typically near the promoter and the Tata box and all the transcriptional machinery on DNA that helps regulate how much transcription happens for any given gene. So if there's less of this transcription factor, my Tregs aren't going to work. So there's going to be less Treg function. And Tregs regulate negatively, right? This is an example of negative feedback. They negatively regulate CD4 cells. So I'm going to have more of those. And therefore, I'm going to have more interferon gamma, which is the cytokine, predominant cytokine that Th1 CD4 positive T cells produce. And it seems very simplistic, but the way I work through students, and the way a lot of coaches I think should approach MCAT tutoring is to help you build confidence in doing this kind of reasoning on your own, right? And there's a lot of different checklists that I have done for every single section. And a lot of time I think that's best spent with students is really doing guided and timed passages together. And that's what, over thousands of hours of tutoring, I've recognized that's the single thing that helps students build the most confidence. I can lecture you about content and I can give you an overview of how, all these different parts of the immune system work. But if we work together to come up with maybe a weekly schedule, we come up with a plan for you to be able to learn the content, and I'm step in when you need that help for filling in any of the gaps in content. But we spend most of our time doing passages together and really building the kind of reasoning skill you see in medical school that is necessary, right? To do well in step 1 and step 2. That's how you're going to get the highest score in this test. And I do want to leave about 10 minutes really for questions so I can learn what kind of questions you guys have. I'll have you guys put them in the chat and I'll kind of go through and read through them in a second. But what I want to emphasize is that if you take away anything from just the few minutes we have together today, is to really approach this test as a reasoning test. It's here to test your ability to think critically and problem solve much more than it is to regurgitate and memorize content. So don't be too tough on yourself as you try and try not to get overwhelmed by all the content that exists. As you do lots and lots of problems, you're going to recognize what is high yield, what's important, what gets tested again and again in the MCAT. And if I had to shout a few out, right, amino acids are really important. Knowing the character, the structure, alongside being able to know, research models, what do knockouts do, what is, and psych-soc, knowing your critical terms like conditioning. But beyond the content will really be all this different kind of problem solving. So I know we don't have a lot of time, but I do want to leave about 10 minutes since we have to end at 7:25 today for you guys to be able to ask questions. So I'm going to take a look at the chat and slowly, as I see questions, I will begin to answer them. Okay. So this is a great question from Kira. So for passage-based, you wouldn't read the passage at all first? No, so that's not quite accurate. So let me clarify. So if it's a passage-based question, my tip to you is that don't spend a lot of time reading the passage on your first read through. So the first time you see a passage, I spend typically only 2 or 3 minutes. And here's why. The MCAT is never going to ask you, let's say, for example, this passage we have here, they're not going to ask you, what was the central theme of this passage? Or what is the overall state of CD4 biology today, right? The MCAT is really going to test in the science sections your ability to reason specific pieces of evidence in the text. So what a lot of people do, a big mistake, is they spent oftentimes 4, 5, 6 minutes of the 10 minutes you have per passage trying to underline and highlight everything on your first read through. And instead, I think it's much, much better to read it kind of quickly first, get an idea of what's going on. Okay, this is a passage about Tregs and CD4s. Great. And then when it's passage-based and you know you have to read the answer choices and go back, then you can spend more time to really read it in depth. And because this is a nice segue, is that in cars is the one section I didn't have a chance to really talk about today. The strategy is very different. So while in Chem Phys and Biochem, I want you to read through it relatively quickly and spend most of the time on the questions. In cars, your time is actually better spent on the passage. Like spend 5 or 6 minutes really breaking down the passage because it's going to help you apply the checklist much more effectively. In cars, the passage is harder, while to summarize and in science sections, the problems are typically harder. Let's go into other questions. So Rohan says, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if it's already been answered, but can you please give a few tips about tackling the cars section? Sure. So cars is in big picture a an assessment of how well you can, one, comprehend the passage, but two, really just apply strategy. Believe it or not, you don't need to know content for cars, right? So it becomes a lot of just playing I Spy. So you have two types of questions in cars. Maybe I can go over the checklist because I have a couple minutes. And in cars, all the questions are either going to be broad, right, or they're going to be specific. And in the broad strategy, the questions are almost always going to be in line. The right answer is going to be the one that is best in line with the main idea. So what's a broad question? A broad question is like, what is the central theme of this passage? If the author was, found a study that said so and so, how would it impact the main argument the author is trying to make, right? It's a big picture question. In all of those big picture questions, people tend to get stuck because two or three answer choices might be accurate on their own, right? But what you're going to realize is that as we get good at recognizing what is the main idea of the passage, what are they really talking about? You're going to get better at being able to recognize only one of the answer choices is really relevant. Most of the answers that you guys pick incorrectly in broad questions tend to be because they might be accurate in one part, one line in the passage somewhere, but they're not really relevant to what the passage was really about. So while I told you spend 5 or 6 minutes, really break down the passage in cars, your only big picture goal is to take away with the main idea. And so how I practice this with students is that we read every single paragraph and only highlight what the main point is. I call that the MP. So we learn how to highlight what the main point is. And as you get better and better at that for every single paragraph, ultimately you get a better understanding of what the main idea was. And we use this to answer our broad questions. The second part of the checklist, so I can share it quickly, and this is recorded, so you're going to get all this information sent to you. Specific questions you treat very similarly to the passage-based questions. So you first screen the answer choices, right? So you know it's specific. It's saying, hey, what cytokine was released in CD4 T cells? Something like this in this passage. And you would screen, okay, you read the answer choices, and then again, you scan the passage. So I'm going literally top to bottom. I'm looking for CD4 T cells here. I found it, right? And then I just read in depth now to find the evidence in the text. And here it says interferon gamma. Obviously, in a CARS passage, it's much more dense and there's much more going on, but that's just kind of an idea of how basic CARS strategy works. Okay. I believe Kyra says, how do you efficiently review practice exams you take? That is a great question. I think one really good strategy for reviewing practice exams comes from actually a system I helped develop for Yale medical students here when I started coaching for step 1 and step 2. And that is to log your incorrects in a spreadsheet. And this is kind of what it would look like, right? So imagine we have a spreadsheet and you're going to have an ID column. So this is where you write, for example, this was AAMC 3 unscored, question number 1 in ChemPhys, something like this, right? And then I would love for students to come up with a new question. So don't just copy and paste what question you got wrong. Instead, come up with a content specific question. So for example, let's say we got this question here wrong, right? In a global knockout, what is the expected serum levels of interferon gamma? Let's say we got that wrong. I don't want you to copy and paste this and put it on your spreadsheet where you're logging your incorrects. Instead, come up with a new question. So come up with a question that says, okay, what is the predominant cytokine that CD4 T cells produce? Because that would have helped you answer this, right? And maybe that new question I would write here. And then in this last column, write an answer. So you can write your answer. I typically recommend it's just like a few words or one sentence max, like a quick answer. And then over time, what I want you to do is just grow this spreadsheet is going to grow, and you can color code this ID column. So red, orange, yellow, green, based on how well you feel about it. And my tip for you guys is that if it's a Google Sheet, right, you can just hide this last column. You can just make the text white and hide it and just treat this as flashcards. So go through every single row of your incorrects and just ask yourself, just like you would in a flashcard, quiz yourself. Do I know the answer? Yes or no? If yes, you can change the color coding. You can change it from red to orange or orange to yellow. And If no, if you got it wrong, then you go the other way. If it was orange, it goes back to red, right? And what this will become over time, I have all of my students do this, and it's really helped, is that all of the AMC questions you ever get wrong are going to be logged in one place. And this is actually, I should have clarified, I make a spreadsheet for every section. So this, for example, let's say this is my Chem Phys spreadsheet, right? For my Chem Physics section, all of my Chem Phys incorrects, ever since I've done any AMC problems, right, they're all going to be on that one sheet. And this is really helpful because one, you get to see all the reds slowly become green. Like you get a visual, it helps with test taking anxiety to see you kind of conquering all that content. But also, like, let's say 2 weeks before your test, you're saying, hey, what do I need to prioritize? I'm feeling overwhelmed. You just go to your spreadsheet and you only review the questions that are red, right? Or orange. Courtney asks, how do you know what the new question should be? Is it just based on the base topic of the question? Close. So the new question, and to answer Cairo's question too, it's not just for, isn't for all question types. It can be the discrete questions, the passage-based questions, or the experimental questions. Regardless of the question type, the new question is always going to be a content-specific question. So if you got a question wrong because you just read it wrong, or you knew the content but picked it wrong, for some reason as a silly mistake, that doesn't need to go on the spreadsheet. The point of the spreadsheet is for there only to be content-based mistakes. So regardless of question type, if you got a question wrong because you didn't know some specific content, I want you to make your new question addressing that specific gap. If I didn't know what the role of ghrelin versus leptin was, I would specifically ask, okay, what is the role of ghrelin? Question mark. A simple question and a simple answer, right? So this is a tool to log your incorrects to study content. Some of the ones that I missed earlier that was emphasized. What tips do you have for courses you took a long time ago when trying to study or practice that portion of the exam? Like I took physics almost 6 years ago. That is a great question. I think some students benefit from a content-only phase. I tend to give people like anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks to really, let's say, play catch up for all the content that you haven't taken in a long time. I would say my favorite resource is Khan Academy for that, just to watch videos. But I want you to do it like effectively. Like it's really futile sometimes to watch a lot of videos and then you just forget them all, right? You go through all these videos, you feel like you're not making progress. So what I have people do is either Khan Academy or whatever, pick your favorite content resource, watch a video, watch a topic, and then go to Anki. And I recommend this deck called Anking. And what you should do is then you should go unsuspend only the relevant cards for what you studied, right? So don't go to your Anki deck and unsuspend everything because then you have thousands of cards. Instead, treat it like a class, like make a weekly schedule. And in your study schedule, it can be maybe one day I'm going to do one section of biochem. And maybe the second day I will do one section of chem phys. And the other day, maybe one section of psych soc. Every day when you finish your assigned content homework, be it a Khan Academy video or a chapter in Kaplan, then go to some memorization tool and unlock those cards. So Anki is a great way to do it. And a lot of my students really like this technique. What they do is that they're going to watch like one module of Khan Academy and then go to Anking, and Anking has tags, and they'll go unsuspend all the cards relevant to that. Let's say you watched a video about the nephron, they'll go unsuspend all the nephron cards. And then the next day, maybe you watch a video about conditioning, they'll go watch all the conditioning cards. Last question, because we're going to run out of time, but you guys are always welcome to reach out to me to study, schedule a free intro call or, to actually help get some tutoring. And this is, do you recommend taking a practice exam first before studying and prepping? I do. I do. And I think the test that you should take should be an AMC exam, and it's going to be the AMC free unscored. I think that is the least representative of the real deal. So it's okay to use it up early, and it's also unscored. So you don't actually get the scale score. And a lot of time, a lot of the best tutors will ask you to bring the score you get from that diagnostic test to us so that we can actually break it down with you and come up with a customized study schedule for you. And very quickly, how many hours a day? Really no more than 4 or 6 hours a day, right? If you're working full time, and if not, 1 or 2 hours a day. This test is not about volume. People spend a lot of time and can be really inefficient. At the very least, get one coaching session from someone or a free intro call just so you can figure out how to come up with like a reasonable plan for you in the short amount of time that you might have until your test day. So I know that was a lot. I tried to cover as much as I could fit in the 25 minutes, but thank you guys so much for joining. We do have to wrap up because there's another call soon here. But if any other questions come up, please reach out. I do a free intro Zoom for half an hour with anyone, even if you don't end up doing tutoring, right? And at least you can get some advice. And if not, if you want some advice about admissions or anything related to that process, if you guys are applying soon, you can also shoot me a message on Leland. Um, awesome. And wish you guys all the best.